I'm not going to reply to Lawrence's arguments. I have my own set of arguments, except to say that he shows no sympathy at all for the Russian position in this, and in fact he dubs it as paranoia. And that, I think, is something to bear in mind. In arguing Russia's invasion was provoked, I'm not saying that it was justified. There are different ways of responding to provocation. Provocation was real, but Russia's response in 2022 was fatally flawed. It overestimated the ease of overthrowing Zelensky and underestimated the support he would get from the West. One of its many adverse consequences, which we shouldn't ignore, was to turn most Ukrainians into bitter enemies of Russia. Having said that, we must also not ignore the provocation offered by Ukraine itself. Ukraine isn't plucky little Belgium or the Sudetenland. Ever since the 1920s, there's been a strong nationalist anti-Russian current located in western Ukraine. Critically, the nationalist leader, Stepan Bandera, raised a Ukrainian army to fight with the Germans against the Russians. That's something deeply etched in Russian memory. And this helps to explain the formation of the military Azov Brigade in 2014 with its neo-Nazi symbolism, and also helps explain this otherwise mysterious pledge of Putin to denazify Ukraine as one of his war objectives. Western support for Ukrainian nationalism has added a crucial foreign policy dynamic to this cocktail by linking it to the West's aim of incorporating Ukraine into NATO. Hence the double Russian purpose of keeping Ukraine out of NATO and protecting Russian minorities inside Ukraine. Now, of course, Tony has dealt with the sense of betrayal of that broken promise, which Lawrence says was never sort of really seriously meant. And anyway, it was. But there are two betrayers in the Russian account of this. One is the Western powers, the Americans for making a promise they didn't intend to keep, and the other is Gorbachev for not tying down this promise into a new security treaty. For Gorbachev, for the West, Gorbachev is a hero. For the Russians, he's a traitor. When he ran for president against Boris Yeltsin in 1996, he received, do you know how many percent of the votes? 0.5%. A vivid memory of my own is being shown by a Russian officer the line of plinths of former Soviet leaders along the Kremlin wall behind the Lenin mausoleum in Red Square. On seeing a vacant plinth, I asked somewhat mischievously to the officer showing me around, is this being reserved for Gorbachev? To which I got the reply, no, his proper resting place is Washington. Tony Brenton has shown how Western diplomacy heedlessly ignored Russia's quest for a new European security system. After all, as Lawrence said, NATO is a purely defensive alliance, has no expansionist aims, no expansionist objects at all. You tell that to any number of countries around the world which have experienced NATO's peaceful intentions. Now, the immediate cause of the present war was the Maidan uprising of January-February 2014, which overthrew the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych and installed a nationalist president in his place. We in the West portray this as a popular rising against a corrupt and oppressive regime. The Russians see it as a CIA-financed and orchestrated coup against a democratically elected government. Backing the Russian version is the famous leaked telephone exchange between Assistant Secretary of State Victor Nuland, who just happened to be in Kiev while all this was unfolding, and the American ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt. And talk was about the desirable members of a new Ukrainian government. They were talking about the successor to the regime. When told that the European Union might object to their choice of prime minister, she notably replied, fuck the European Union. That's all on record. But of course, this doesn't prove that the Americans organized the Maidan. that there was a popular uprising is indisputable, but open US official encouragement of regime change plus covert financial and logistical support by the CIA was crucial to its success. Then we have the other episode, the failure of Maidan II. Minsk II. Maidan had led to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the insurrection of the Russian-speaking provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. France and Germany brokered a plan to end the fighting, which included granting a measure of self-government to the rebellious provinces. We see this as being sabotaged by Russian military support for the separatists. But there's plenty of evidence that Kiev was never willing to grant autonomy to the Donbass region, and now we have the admission by former Chancellor Angela Merkel and former French President Hollande that the Minsk negotiations were a deliberate deception to buy Kiev time to crush the rebellion by force. So that's the second episode we need to take into account. Finally, what are we to make of Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev on the 6th of April 2022, 6 weeks after the start of the Russian invasion? A draft treaty between Ukraine and Russia had been agreed, which included provision, is a draft treaty, very important to emphasize that, which included provisions for Ukraine's neutrality and some security guarantees. David Arachmachia, Ukraine's chief negotiator, summed up the gist of Johnson's intervention as follows. Johnson brought two simple messages to Kiev. The first is that Putin is a war criminal, he should be pressured, not negotiated with, and the second is that even if Ukraine agrees to compromise peace, they, the NATO powers, are not willing to agree. This amounted to an Anglo-American veto on further peace talks. Days after Johnson returned to London, a cascade of arms supplied from Britain and the United States was announced, and Putin declared that the talks had reached a dead end. Now, the story told by Tony and myself is not one of unfolding ambition of Putin to restore the Russian Empire, nor of paranoia at these about Western intention. It's rather a story of a humiliated Russia desperately trying to cling on to the remnants of its broken shield in face of relentless pressure by the United States using Ukraine as a Trojan horse for its political ambitions. Now, what distresses me most about mainstream British attitudes today, and I think some of them were echoed in the second speech, is that Putin is a reincarnation of Hitler, and that he's not.
I didn't say that.
No, you didn't. No, I said it's a very, very, very representative attitude, and that if he's defeated, he will go on and on. Together with this goes a gross neglect of the moral value of peace and indifference to the killing in what Boris Johnson himself called a proxy war. The death toll on both sides, do you know how much it is? About 300,000 or 400,000 soldiers alone have been killed, equal to the number of soldiers Britain lost in the whole of the Second World War. Of course we shouldn't take the whole blame. After all, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. But we're guilty of egging the Ukrainians on, of adding to the provocation. So I think that's the sort of framework of how we should think of the future. It's only by accepting our share of blame for the carnage and understanding that appeasement is not the same as surrender that we will be morally fit to take part in the healing needed for a lasting peace.